Two of the lectures were not recorded adequately and are re-recorded now from a typescript. So these are essentially read. This is Lecture 3, Clinical Tact. Tact is the ability to deal perceptively with the effects others have on us. In the first lecture, I described such effects as the record of a perspective. But they can also bring crises in which a collision of viewpoints enrages one person or the other and may drive either away. Perhaps the most familiar instance follows collisions with a paranoid perspective. The paranoid perspective startles by its claim to grasp the other's viewpoint, imputing attitudes of hostility and attentiveness onto utter strangers. It is one of the most extraordinary attitudes people present to one another. This outlook, seemingly ready-made and wide-ranging, is the classic instance of a fixed perspective, unmoved or emboldened by denials, facts, and arguments, displacing ours. Let us hear the subtle things implied by such perspectives. It is not that the paranoid person sees how he or she thinks. The patient is not at this point self-conscious. Curiously, the patient does take the other as an object, claiming to know that person's perspective. It is also clear that this outlook contains an affect, anger. At first, the patient is only conscious of anger in what has been taken as an object, that is, the imputed attitude of the other, not yet taking any anger of his own that way. The result of this imputation, which is called a projection, is to make the other angry, thus producing what is claimed. To put such a perspective squarely in the place of the others invites rage. When this occurs, the patient begins to take his own imputation and anger as objects, now finding them justified. The circle is closed. Such is the start of frequently dangerous escalations, not only in the clinic, but at home. I mention the home because people not clinically paranoid engage in these exchanges and may be unable, even at tranquil times, to detect how it got started. Plainly, a great potential for such exchanges resides in human nature, spilling over into the clinic. There, too, it is often difficult to know who started what. For example, when did the other get mad? Clinicians tend to claim the patients start angry, although this may not always be true. Even in those instances when clinicians do not get angry, they may still try correcting the patient's perspective by presenting evidence, the so-called reality testing. Again, as we learn at home, this can be experienced as a collision, acting like confirming anger to escalate a quarrel. The concept of projection was introduced for the hypothesis that paranoid people cannot contain their rage and therefore project it out onto others. This is a useful hypothesis. Its strict application, however, tends to overlook the extent to which patients' rage depends upon others' confirmation of it, and by extension overlooks the ways in which non-confirming behavior may reverse it. Here is implicit my first suggestion about clinical tact. The component of tact useful in paranoid situations turns on a self-conscious use of perspectives, in sharp contrast with the almost reflexive exchanges I have just described. At this critical point, we need a perspective capacious enough to give refuge to the most differing viewpoints, an almost kaleidoscopic perspective. I mean the clinician must be able to speak for the patient's viewpoint out of his own representative and honestly acknowledged experience. It is difficult for me to believe that everyone has not experienced misunderstanding and injustice, even felt paranoid, and that some such paranoid reactions have proved justified. You need only stub your toe to learn that anger, pain, and blaming, whatever you encountered, are well-nigh universal reactions. Therefore, a willingness to see it the patient's way, even to extend that perspective beyond what the patient has reached, and with as much or more feeling, these should be in everyone's repertoire. The patient's firm, vociferous posture and the accompanying insistence, "I know how you think," is to be greeted without anger or correction. The goal is not to justify and harden the patient's viewpoint. Doing so will also correct a common misunderstanding. Many fear that sharing this perspective will deepen it, when in fact sharing it can abort it in the short run and allow the emergence of a fresh perspective in the long run. I use instances of abuse, injustice, outrage I have encountered. Sometimes I multiply these with passion. "Of course these things happen," I say. "I've seen it myself. You may not have been able to believe it," I say. "What were you supposed to think? I hope this isn't what's happening to you." Note that taking the patient's perspective as a serious possibility from one's own experience is an almost heavy-handed taking of that perspective as an object. I hold it up, broaden and extend it, fill it with my own examples, then wish it were not true. On occasion I have carried this to the point of the patient's responding, "It's not that bad, I have some friends," or "Don't be so paranoid, Doc." I may not stop then. I may say, "I am older than you. I have had more time to see the horror of life." And this is true. What I call a kaleidoscopic viewpoint is this shifting multiple view. There are many places to stand, remarkable experiences, no single possibility. Contradiction and collision are to give way to seeing the truth in the other, acknowledging it, stating and regretting facts and feelings, hoping for something better. We thereby encourage the patient to take his own perspective as an object, not because it is confirmed by our anger, but because we are both looking at it from a sympathetic and shifting perspective, which may gradually replace the exclusively paranoid one. Clinical tact has two goals: to diffuse the immediate crisis and prepare for long-term change. These goals correspond to the attitudes recommended toward all perspectives. At first, they are given the benefit of the doubt, then embraced from similar but broader perspectives, within which the patient's viewpoints are contained as possibilities. And both goals are undertaken from the clinician's experience. Only this establishes the clinician as a trustworthy student of the patient's problems. We can speak of a naturalization of even alien perspectives on the basis of shared experiences, first with the goal of reducing patients' anger and isolation, and then opening viewpoints to one another's scrutiny. Much later in these lectures, I will take up the most stubborn element we recognize in viewpoints, the intractably repetitive, largely unconscious one, and how that can be engaged. The present purpose is to create a relationship in which viewpoints can be joined and then a little widened. I began with the paranoid perspective because it is the most dramatic anyone encounters. Its definiteness, high-handedness, arrogance instantly brand the paranoid person as mad. What no small number feel quietly in secret, that few support them and many are enemies, is here announced to an outraged world. Another conviction almost as outrageous regularly follows, that the paranoid person not only feels persecuted, but is also superior, that everyone has the patient in mind even before the patient appears because the patient is important, perhaps the most important person in the world. Again, the patient is not an uncommon view in its quieter forms, nor is it hard to understand. There is a sense in which we all occupy the centers of our worlds, are the person in whom we have the largest investment, especially at times when fellow feeling runs low and conventional sociability is exhausted, so that the world both contracts to and enlarges with our self-concern. What is tact to do? Every clinician fears the sudden impact of unexpected facts, a recent death, shameful impulse, or confession of a crime. Revelations of grandiosity occur as a rule more slowly, and what we have been told dawns more slowly still, so improbable does it seem. The clinician of paranoid states should be prepared like a courtier before an erratic king. I tend to bow a little, look pleased to be in the presence of such a one, and to activate an awareness that anyone needing these pretensions must be very unsure indeed. I like to remind myself that few of our self-deceptions are very clear to any of us. The grandiose person is only rare in the enormity of his claim. Most of all, I mean to cultivate a gentleness as if I were the surgeon of a burned body which could scarcely bear a touch. A lightly deferential respect, sympathy, as much gentleness as I have, these are the first steps. Recall the sentence with which Marlowe describes his approach to the raw Lord Jim. He said, "I had no intention, for the sake of barren truth, to rob him of the smallest particle of any grace that would come in his way." But what would it be to carry a grandiose viewpoint up into a shared and broader one? Here I invoke the moral force of a viewpoint. Perhaps the patient has been laid low, unable now to see himself as he wished to. So why is he set so high? Why does he go to such extremes in his retreat? Freud had an ingenious answer. When a person's ideals are enough disappointed, the energy invested in those ideals streams back on the person himself to inflate his self-image. In the famous expression, the ego ideal is the inheritor of primitive narcissism. Let me describe the clinical events in purely psychological terms, without recourse to physical concepts of energy and libido, because such concepts cannot have more than a pretend science value as long as there are no ways to measure them. Ideals, I have argued, are the forms of moral perspective. They are the ways we need to see ourselves. Sufficiently disappointed, they may be given up altogether, and with them, the perspective we had in ourselves, our self-consciousness. The loss may be so painful we cannot look on ourselves at all. We cease to be an object for ourselves. We are pure subject, therefore at the center of the world. We cannot, for example, see others as like ourselves because we cannot see ourselves. Any attempt to get the patient to look at himself is opposed. He either cannot understand what is meant, or is fiercely resistant to what he experiences as humiliation, suggesting a residual clinging to fragments of the lost ideal. To follow the lives of patients whose perspectives we attempt to reconstruct is to see these options repeated over and over again until they are gradually replaced by a fresh belief in an ideal which can anchor the way they see themselves. Clinical tact in dealing with grandiosity means taking steps toward this fresh belief. But how introduce ideals, the possibility of a favorable perspective on the self, when self-consciousness is absent or residual and unbearable? Here again the characteristics of the psychological guide us. The moral is anchored in perspective, but it does not feel that way. Something seemingly outside gives the subjective an apparent objectivity, perhaps the strength of an all-seeing eye of God. As I said, the moral is experienced as the Word of God, and if not, of parents and society. When we fail our ideals, that failure means shame before God, family, and society. Then we may want nothing more to do with ourselves, losing a vital connection. But it can be recovered along the same path on which it vanished. The authority on mental health and sickness, into whose hands the sick person is put, cannot be an authority on morals. He or she is not licensed to punish or forgive as the state and church do. But the clinician is licensed to pronounce on health and sickness, to readmit to human being and nature people who fall outside the pale. So ours is a licensed tact. When I say, How awful to have disappointed yourself so, but how wonderful to have those grand ideals. I speak to the now scattered self, forlorn and empty, yet clinging to something grand. The bits and pieces of the broken perspective are taken up, sympathized with, admired, with the goal of restoring a viewpoint. Note the way in which how awful as an expression operates. It is empathic, it bespeaks the pain, yet it also characterizes this fragment of a viewpoint, not critically, but as an instance of human pain. It says, I would feel that way too. Again, clinicians bring their own experience. We are in this together. The empathic gesture is a necessary step because there is no communicating a fresh perspective until there is a close, felt communion in which to welcome it. The patient needs to feel the clinician's thoughts and feelings mingling with his own. Then the patient's sense of grandeur can be more directly addressed. Oh, that you could really know it, feel your strength. Better now the patients look at our ideal of them than at their own shattered ones. Expect a real disbelief. We will carry for a while, often for a long while, the whole burden of hope. This is because the patient's strength may never have been believed in. Its erratic and uncertain presentation may have occasioned the collapse. Expect this despair to open out beyond the fragile grandeur. The resulting goal is not to persuade the patient, but to shelter his or her unbelief while we go on believing. We do not want obedience, even acceptance, but simply that we be heard and felt. Again, clinical tact is counterintuitive. Arguing with a paranoid accusation is the natural response, or putting down grandiosity. One perspective is then met head-on by another. But when I translate grandiosity into universal aspirations, and the accompanying complaints into wishes for support toward the great hopes, I ally myself with what is healthy, the desire to look well on oneself and to get help in doing so. No, you argue, the patient should face their bankruptcy, their underlying depression, even psychosis, accepting these facts. I respond, none of these acceptances are humanly possible without resignation or suicide until the patients are supported, believed in as people with a different future. Remember, the grandiose patients are demoralized. They have lost an acceptable outlook on themselves, and are merely clinging to fragments of ideals. A start must be made on these ideals' restorations before additional bad news is faced. The counterintuitive position is to look well on the patients and then take that perspective up as an object to show both the patient and the world. This is what you have struggled to be, I say. We will make sure the others see it. The patient should become a little puzzled, even astonished, as his or her subjectivity is given the qualities of an object that can be looked at and admired. Before, when the patient was alone, grandiosity seemed a last-ditch stand, a defiance. Now it is a shared position which will be modified, parts brought to reality, defended. The goal is a livable perspective on oneself. Elsewhere I used existential language to outline what I consider its most general characteristics. A shy acceptance of this singular existence of our own, to which we are both entrusted and exposed. This is certainly more wary than grand, but it pays honor to a sensible suspiciousness which may stand in the same relation to clinical paranoia as one's being entrusted to a singular existence stands to grandiosity. Tact is also a steadfast resistance to those remarks we are most tempted to make. It is useful to think of the time spent with patients as a minefield, the dangers of which are scattered and various. To argue with the paranoid, humiliate the grandiose, these are obvious dangers. Many others lie about, covert and subtle. Sound work is to a large extent avoiding them. Here is a set of 3. The self-depreciative tempt others to depreciate them. The critical and invasive prompt neglect of their intelligence and power. The hopeless offer chance after chance to confirm their hopelessness. Temptations are laid down by the successive impacts of one perspective on another. The self-depreciative present an outlook marked by inward turning, negatively charged comments signaling, "hit me." What can be modesty as an amiable trait is here persistent and corrosive, a self-targeting that calls up any obedience or hostility resonant in the listener. Note how tact depends upon adjustment in the listener's perspective, having the general form of a reflection. I can see my outlook meeting the patient's and then respond to this perspective on perspectives rather than to the temptation. Taking oneself as a negative object also tempts the listener forcibly to correct and unseal that perspective, as long as only the patient's outlook is grasped, and not the listener's. Then we are tempted to say, "It's wrong to think so badly of yourself." The obvious danger of such direct attack is there being an intellectualized form of the temptation to hit me. The patient has gotten attacked for attacking himself. A less obvious danger is adding a fresh basis for self-depreciation, the fact that one is self-depreciating. This is again an aspect of psychological reflectiveness. I become anxious about being anxious, depressed about being depressed, or self-degrading. The mind's capacity to take itself as an object and then to take that reflection as an object, ad infinitum, deepens and extends negative concerns. Hence the value of not dwelling, of not attending too much to such concerns or distracting oneself with them. Every successful leader knows the importance of correcting similar group cycles, for example, by the leaders not showing fear. 2 psychotherapeutic devices, reframing and paradoxical intention, work to the same end and illustrate how perspectives function. Reframing is an invitation to change perspectives. The clinician describes self-depreciation as modesty, perhaps, or the wise capacity to acknowledge faults. I like to mention Dr. Johnson's definition of genius, the infinite capacity for taking pains. That is, one takes on oneself the pain of getting it right, self-corrections, to the end of much better work. In this way, clinicians can avoid depreciating the self-depreciative and may open the way to broadening the patient's perspective. Paradoxical intention is more complex. The patient reports a troubling desire, say, to heave bricks through plate glass windows, or insults at himself. Instead of being appalled or critical, the clinician urges the patient to try it. Often this produces striking relief, not because the patient has done it, but because the impulse subsides or is no longer troublesome. Perhaps the clinician supporting the impulse is seen as empathic, the impulse being shared, that is, apportioned or divided between patient and clinician, loses its force. Or the clinician's non-critical stance acts to offset the patient's conscience and guilt, rendering the impulse less troublesome. Both of these explanations can reflect changes in perspective. The clinician's support represents an unexpected outlook, which allows the patient to see the impulse as less bad, more human than was previously felt. The search for a new perspective can therefore be added to avoiding temptations in the interest of responding tactfully to self-depreciation. But neither of these suggestions does justice to the extraordinary difficulty of recognizing hidden forms of a self-depreciative outlook and penetrating them. It seems that some patients can press anything and everything into the service of targeting themselves. The widespread belief that we are responsible not only for what we do, but for whatever happens to us, that at some level we will our fate, in contrast merely to being exposed to it, provides extraordinary opportunities for self-blame. Oddly, this idea has been promoted by many psychoanalysts who find unconscious wishes everywhere, despite the broad historical determinism of the Freudian system and the fact of other people's wishes. We have all been urged to take responsibility for ourselves, or told we all are already responsible, especially by people who are angry with us. Yet it is not clear what this allocation of responsibility means. We are certainly not responsible for picking our parents, our genes, or our consciences, or for much else of our bodies and minds, and broad social determinants are all about us. I am not against people being responsible for themselves, but to what extent is it possible? Can we assign responsibility to people without broad knowledge of their backgrounds? Responsibility is neither easily given or taken. My own impression is that taking responsibility for what happens is a lifelong and desperate struggle with generally mixed results. I have also observed responsibility being attached to others as a means of social control. If something goes wrong, it's your fault. A significant part of the present American culture has, I think, been pulling, often wisely, in the opposite direction, to the point of people feeling themselves victims, playthings of fate. I call such beliefs, at either extreme, neurotic delusions, when they are taken up by individuals without detailed knowledge of specific facts, yet they are often central to perspectives. A heavy sense of responsibility means feeling to blame for whatever happens. We deserve it. Some perspectives are so colored in this way that disaster seems a relief, confirming what was anticipated. Blaming oneself, depreciating oneself are then only statements of personal responsibility. Clinicians having themselves such an outlook will not find it easy to introduce alternate ones. Again, a livable perspective is as much to be hoped for as a livable body. Just this need to find an outlook somewhere between overwhelming responsibility and irresponsibility was one reason I recommended a shy acceptance of this singular existence to which we are at once entrusted and exposed. We are entrusted to it, that is, we are given some responsibility for it. On the other hand, this responsibility is also an exposure to much that befalls, not our making. So the acceptance must be shy. Surely we don't know what we're getting into. A similar problem confronts workers dealing with critical and invasive patients. It is true those traits often reflect energy and intelligence not at first obvious. But we may be in no mood to admit it. In such instances, we also confront an issue of perspectives only hinted at above, the importance of differences in their powers. Experience suggests a principle. Treatment works best when neither party is overwhelmed by the other. The so-called borderline syndrome refers to many instances of critical and invasive patients. No doubt these traits are responsible for much of the attention given the syndrome. Clinicians get furious, fired, resigned, or bewildered. They are frequently overwhelmed. Being themselves so often blamed may account for the pejorative cast of the resulting descriptions. A war ensues in both offices and books, which shows no signs of abating. The characteristic borderline sequence of great hopes and praise, for example, you're the first doctor I've met who understands me, followed by disappointment and rage, first softens and then upsets the most settled perspectives. Many wish to be calm during hurricanes and earthquakes, which imposes a fresh demand on an already harried system, and worse, may blunt the signals of oncoming danger. We need our outlooks to record the most varied sensations, What we also need is what the words aerial and linear perspective convey. The experience of distance given by gradations of color, distinctness, and size. The rush of the hurricane or the force of the patient's words and feelings compress the distance between us, scattering our perspective before the elements of the others. To see the whole scene is to recover perspective, that is, a distance from which both patient and clinician can be viewed. Tact is again resistance to the responses we are most tempted to make. It is claimed that near death, many individuals' perspectives rise above the dying body and view it placidly from above. An imaginative disengagement is effected from a body abandoned prematurely, and much as in dreams and some psychoses, the mind cuts loose from its ordinary constraints of time and space. People with creative imaginations accomplish something similar without sleep or the threat of death. It is the conscious, controlled application of such a state that the management of clinical hurricanes demands. This is greatly helped by an early weighing of the relative powers of the parties involved. Throughout these lectures, the issue of the relative power of perspectives is never far away. Perspectives represent collected affects, what can be termed will. These are engines behind the perceptual and cognitive outposts comprising an individual's sense of the world. Pulling oneself free of immediate engagement with another is an act of will, exercised as imaginative power to shift perspectives. It is also an act of courage, since the fear of drawing away must be overcome, which can feel like turning one's back on an enemy. Critical invasive patients embody an opposite movement, toward engagement. Contrast this too with the paranoids assuming we are already engaged. The softening period which precedes the battle with invasive patients is a seduction, an appeal, at once closing the distance between us. Such a rapid closure represents a merger of perspectives, like falling in love, that must be distorted or artificial because there is no way, barring an extraordinary coincidence, for so complete a concordance to occur with little time for adjustments. The resulting struggle is assured. Of course, these appeals ought in principle to be resisted, but this would require in many cases such a glacial disposition that we had better resign to the reality of the flesh. In addition, the insight gained through the rapid seduction may not be reached, certainly not felt otherwise. It is what we do with the experience that counts, like waking up with a hangover. It can have various results. Again, a shy acceptance bespeaks facing the facts while hesitating to embrace them. We might say, "How appealing you are," or remember Justice Holmes' words when he was 80 and passing a pretty girl, "Oh, to be 70 again." The point is we need a perspective that both acknowledges the facts and protects us from their worst results, neither ice nor fire. And to repeat a central message of all these remarks, such a livable perspective is what we give the invasive patient who may be tired of running between fire and ice. Nevertheless, fire and ice are indispensable. For example, the invasive patient may possess both a cold intelligence and a hot power which clinicians can envy and celebrate. This celebration, in turn, can provide the necessary trade-off if the patient as well is to attend to, perhaps abandon, the worst results. When clinicians tease apart saving features from what troubles them in the other's powerful perspective, they place themselves within a general rule. Most, perhaps all human traits have both a downside and an upside, depending on what they are used for and with whom. I have remarked already on the uses of self-depreciation as a way toward more accurate, self-corrected work. Many seductive invasive patients are only those things relative to the composed, more introverted style so common among therapists. The hopeful, lusty way the former go at life has many values, among which is the entitlement to say, "If you received me once so warmly, why are you now so cold?" Clinicians may have become frightened of the initial closeness and then withdrawn, The first change is not always the patient's. Differences in intelligence also cause trouble. I remember a patient of my own whose mind seemed to me so much subtler and more discriminating than my own, I felt clumsy and bumbling. It would have been easy to charge through him, crowing that he did not get what in fact I could not get. Patients more openly critical than he politely was subject our ideas to often withering attacks or use them against us. Jungian patients decry the Freudian doctors. Natural-born existentialists cannot abide the role-playing of the interpersonalists. What is acceptable between competing journals and societies is not given free play in the office. And because these are not intellectual differences, merely, but differences of temperament, value, outlook, arguments get nowhere. The fact is, we must be readier to learn than the patients. There is a real sense in which we are paid to be taught. I close on the problem of hopelessness. Many come to us trying one last time. Sometimes they do not let on, lest we be fearful or discouraged. They may already know the negative side of what I have been saying about tact. People, as a rule, receive bad news either by dismissing it with hollow reassurance or by confirmations of despair. And we are right to feel discouraged, tapping the depths of real despair. Otherwise, we haven't heard it. This is one of the many vital uses of medication, to treat our own as well as the patient's mood, because lifting the patient's mood lifts our own. As I remarked, there are many occasions we must carry the whole burden of hope. We can't ask the patient to hope because that brands clinicians as failures to grasp where the genuinely despairing patients are. Moreover, not a few have had no experiences giving them reason to hope. Until their worlds change, their nervous systems cannot record it. They would be mad to hope. Finally, when their worlds do change, we meet the reactions of hopeless people in a new world. They still can't believe it, and will do so only slowly as their brains and perspectives come round. Here again, medication is often necessary, lest setbacks in the changing of that world prove fatal. The gradual moving of perspectives, as one result of the collision of perspectives, is thus both hopeful and dangerous. There is a resemblance to surgery, not now on the basis of detachment, but instead on the need to record and transform the dangers conveyed. Such are not casual or largely intellectual encounters, but sometimes incorrigible grapplings with worlds that we barely see.